Okay, I think we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Lisa Roberts, and it is my honor to serve as the president of the Westchester Jewish Council. Thank you all for joining us today for this important briefing. We're grateful for our ongoing relationship with the New York State Attorney General's office and her professional team, and we greatly appreciate Ms. James's time today. The relationships the Council has built over time with our elected officials has enabled important and ongoing two-way communication that is both relevant and beneficial to our Jewish community. The Council is honored to coordinate our government work with many of our member organizations, and especially our partners at UJA Federation. Attorney General Letitia James last spoke to a large gathering of Westchester Jewish leaders at the Westchester Government Relations Annual Legislative Breakfast, co-sponsored with UJA Federation back in May of 2019, which feels like 100 years ago. We are honored and delighted to welcome her back. The Westchester Jewish Council is proud to serve as the central communicating, convening, and connecting organization for Westchester Jewry. We are proud of our 44 years of service to the community, working closely with our 135 plus member organizations, including synagogues and agencies, which in turn serve the Jewish community of Westchester of nearly 150,000 Jews. We have been particularly well positioned and active during the current COVID-19 crisis, working to provide critical information and resources to our member organizations and the broader Jewish community through our communications, briefings, webinars, and through our signature roundtables. Our mission is simple. The Westchester Jewish Council serves to connect Jews to Jews, Jews to Israel, Jews to our elected officials, and importantly, Jews to the broader community. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. All attendees at this briefing have been muted. We received several questions in advance, and we will get to those first. If you have questions, please use the chat function by clicking at the bottom of your screen, directing your question to everyone. We will aggregate the questions we receive, and the Attorney General will answer as many as she can within our time frame. If we can't get to your question, the Attorney General's office will follow up. We are recording this briefing and we will share the recording. In a moment, I will introduce Arnold Linhart, a member of the Council's Executive Committee and Chair of our Government Relations Committee. Arnie will introduce our guest speaker. Following the Attorney General's remarks, Harriet Schleifer, Honorary Council Board Member and Vice Chair of our Government Relations Committee, will moderate our Q&A session. And now I will hand it over to Arnie.
Thank you, Lisa. It's my honor to introduce our Attorney General. Letitia, better known as Tish James, is the 67th Attorney General of the state of New York, serving in her first term. And as Lisa said, addressed our annual legislative breakfast back in May of last year. She has decades of work. She's an experienced attorney. She was the former public advocate in the city of New York. She has a long record of accomplishments. I think we all see her name almost every day in the media, from the lawsuits she's brought, the consumer affairs protections she has given the residents of the state of New York. She is the first woman of color to serve as the Attorney General of the state of New York. So it is my honor to introduce our current Attorney General, Tish James.
Thank you. Shalom. Thank you, Arnie, for that gracious introduction. Thanks also to the President, Lisa Roberts, CEO Elliot Forheimer, and my thoughts and my prayers are with him during his period of loss. Our moderator, Harriet Scheffler, and the entire Westchester Jewish Council membership for affording me this opportunity to participate in this important conversation. And I cannot believe that a year has passed since I last spoke at your legislative breakfast. Time certainly has flown by. I want to first bring you up to date on steps my office is taking to combat the two major pandemics facing our state and indeed our nation, COVID-19 and the systematic inequalities that are fueling distrust between police and the communities they serve. I also want to recognize Gary Brown, who is the attorney in charge of our Westchester office, as well as Allison Spindle, who has been very helpful in my transition, and both of them have been helpful in assisting me on the staff. I wish we could all be together in person, but I'm grateful for the technology that has made this meeting possible and is also keeping us connected to colleagues and family and friends during this difficult time. And I see that the storm is brewing outside, but I hope all of you are warm and cozy in your homes and or offices. Let me first say that I'm honored to stand with all of you to face the monumental challenges we face as a nation. As many of you know, my solidarity with New York's Jewish communities is deep and unshakable. It dates back years. It dates back to my city council days where I represented parts of Crown Heights. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Brooklyn, Crown Heights is home to the Lubavitch community, and the Lubavitch community considers me an honorary Lubavitch. And it's important that I stand with Jews, not only in New York, but all across this nation. For many years, there was a lot of tension between the Jewish community and the Black community in Crown Heights, tension that came to a head in 1991 that resulted in the death of a young Black boy and the death of a Jewish student in days of riots. And while I was not in office at that time, the feelings of anger and resentment were still palpable many years later. And when I was elected to the city council in 2003, I made it one of my top priorities to get to know the Lubavitch community, to educate myself about their needs, but also to demonstrate that I was a friend and not a foe. And that despite the history, I was there to bring peace and not pain. So I organized many meetings and events between the Black and the Jewish community so that we could all learn about one another and realize that there is much more that unites us than divides us. Black and Jewish communities have embraced that truth throughout history. I was so glad to have been supportive of the Jewish Children's Museum in Crown Heights and consider a close friend, Deborah Halberstam. To this day, she and I still connect. There is a special bond between myself and the Jewish community that is unique to people who have known and felt the painful sting of persecution and oppression. During the civil rights movement, as I remind everyone, the Black community and the Jewish community, it was young Jewish students, lawyers, and young Black students who rode freedom buses together, who marched arm in arm in Selma and Birmingham, and who worked side by side at voter registration drives to bring equal rights to Jim Crow South. As I see the pictures of the late Congress member, John Lewis, I see him marching arm in arm with a number of Jewish leaders and young protesters, individuals of all races and faiths, to call for an end to racism, anti-Semitism, police brutality, and to stand together arm in arm with no space between them as they stood up against all forms of hate and discrimination. But now, in the face of this pandemic, we have another opportunity to chart a future of mutual respect and love and harmony, and to summon all of that goodwill from the civil rights movement to this day, and to remind everyone about our shared history and about our deep and abiding respect and the loss of life and struggles that we engaged in together to get us to this point. Let me say that I know how hard the heavy hand of COVID-19 has landed here in Westchester County. Since the outbreak began in New Rochelle in March, more than 35,000 of your neighbors have tested positive, and more than 1,500, unfortunately, have lost their lives, and we keep them in our thoughts and in our prayers. The Office of Attorney General, we grieve with you, and we hold the families and loved ones of those who have died in a circle of love and support. We also share your gratitude for the healthcare workers, the grocery workers, the delivery people, individuals whose names we do not know, but who are our quiet heroes, who have risked their lives on the front lines of the deadly pandemic for you and for I. The good news is that because of those first responders, as well as public compliance with social distancing and wearing our masks, and the efforts of so many of you in this wonderful organization, the Mid-Hudson region and Westchester County are now well into phase 4 reopening. But we must remain vigilant. As we have seen other parts of the country, complacency is a recipe for a new spike of infections. And let us remind those young people between the ages of 20 and 30, because we've seen an increase in numbers in that age group. Let us remind them to remain vigilant and to be mindful that the pandemic is still with us. We must also remain vigilant against those who would seek through various frauds and scams to illegally profit off this crisis. I call them bottom feeders, individuals who prey upon vulnerable senior citizens and prey upon all of us just to make a buck. As you know, my office is focused on protecting consumers and seniors and marginalized communities who have become targets for price gouging and fake cures and other despicable scams during this crisis. All you have to do is go online. They're selling lotions and potions and even toothpaste as a cure to COVID-19, and there is no cure. I want to give you a brief overview of some of the steps my office is taking to protect consumers and to stop these bottom feeders, as I call them, who are preying on the most vulnerable here in Westchester and across the state. But first, let me tell you about some of the affirmative steps my office has taken to ease the burden and lessen the stress of New Yorkers who have grave concerns about both their physical and financial health. At a time when so many New Yorkers have lost their jobs and are struggling to make ends meet, my office decided on March 17th to suspend the collection of student loan and medical debt owed to the state of New York. Again, that is student loan and medical debt owed to New York, not private debt, but only that debt which is owed to the state of New York. We suspended it for 30 days. We recently renewed the suspension for the fourth time until August 15th. And after this 30-day period, we will reassess the needs of state residents for another possible extension. We've been working with the governor on a wide range of executive orders. We have issued official guidance to New York State banking institutions, to creditors and debt collectors, making clear that financial relief provided through the federal stimulus package are exempt from garnishment under New York law. And we are hoping and praying that that Congress will pass another stimulus package for those who are unemployed, for businesses, and for those who are struggling during this period. We are reaching out to small businesses and have issued guidance to help them obtain the government's PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, and also provide warnings and tips to protect small businesses from lenders and agents who are fraudulently and deceptively marketing these loans as well. There is a new study out today from researchers at MIT, the Federal Reserve and ADP Research Institute, which shows that these PPP loans save between 1.5 million to 3.5 million jobs for small businesses. And we all know that small businesses are the engine for our economy. And so it's really critically important that we do all that we can to shore up our small businesses. But we do know that a number of small businesses do not have access to that program, and we are trying to assist them in the event that there is a re-up of the PPP program. And we're hoping that there is a re-up for PPP, there's an extension of unemployment, as well as assistance to local and state governments. We are monitoring hate crimes. We have a hate crimes hotline in response to the rise of bias-based incidents. And right now, there's been a number of incidents against the Asian American communities. And so we will stand up against hate against any community. It's really critically important that we all stand together. I've sent letters to 35 of New York's major mortgage servicers, calling on them to provide relief and immediate and long-term relief to all New York homeowners struggling to pay their mortgages. We stand in solidarity with the New York workers who have responded to over 3,000 contacts with our office related to labor issues, confusion as to whether or not they were essential and or non-essential workers, basically given guidance to their work place, and ensuring that their workplace is in compliance with the law and that they are instituting safety protocols. We have also contacted thousands and hundreds of employers and sent out dozens of letters to ensure that these employers are complying with the law. We've not had to go to court to enforce compliance. And I want to thank all of those who have received those letters for their cooperation, ensuring that health and safety protocols have been put in place. We have donated 3,000 gloves and protective masks to the New York State Office of Emergency Management to bolster the state's response for PPE in response to COVID-19. And in response to reports highlighting the dramatic imbalance of health impacts on communities of color, we've called for expanded treatment, rapid testing, tracking for marginalized communities, increased hospital capacity, resources for safety net hospitals, expanded language access, and more protections for essential workers. We also know that there is a food shortage, and we have been working with the administration to provide food to pantries all across the state of New York to address the growing need of individuals who are struggling with food insecurity, and particularly where there are children. We've received more than 7,000 complaints of price gouging, and we've issued more than 1,600 cease and desist orders to businesses, suppliers, and wholesalers. What's interesting is that at the beginning of this pandemic, we received complaints related to price gouging for hand sanitizers, toilet paper, etc. And then most recently, what we're seeing is price gouging of food. Most recently, we've been focused on eggs and meat, and we are working on a number of those cases to focusing on the supply chain and looking at the distributors to determine whether or not they in fact are engaging in price gouging, which is in violation of the law. Finally, let me say a word about our shared commitment to stem the tide of inequality and racism that has reached a tipping point here in New York. As you know, it is my responsibility to enforce the law, and I am protecting individuals' right to engage in peaceful protest. And I was tasked with the responsibility by the governor of the state of New York to release a report reviewing the interactions between protesters and the police department that occurred in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. And while our investigation is ongoing, our preliminary report includes recommendations for systematic police reform in light of the clear breakdown of trust. I had held hearings over a 3-day period where I listened to over 100 protesters who came forward to give me an account of their experience. And it is clear that there is a breakdown, and it's important that we work to rebuild that trust. We also heard from the police commissioner who came to testify, and there was a stark contrast between the testimony of the protesters and that of the police commissioner. It's important that one of the recommendations that we are seeking to address is removing unilateral power from the NYPD commissioner in favor of a commission, in democratizing a system so that not one individual can have jurisdiction over disciplining officers and or removing officers. Over a period of time, I believe it was between 2014 to 2018, not one police officer in the city of New York has been removed from the force despite allegations of abuse, and that is unfortunate. We really need to have more accountability and more transparency, and the public really needs to play a role with respect to the disciplinary activity of police officers. We also need to reevaluate the role of police in society and ensuring that there are mechanisms for public oversight, accountability, and input. The police exist to serve the public, but for too long they've existed as an entity apart, making their own rules. NYPD is the only agency where they make their own rule, and there is no public hearing, no input. It is all done by the police commissioner, and the police department are really not in a position to police themselves. It's important that the public have some role, and that their decision making not be hidden from public scrutiny. They have also been, the police have been unfairly, I would argue, have been unfairly asked to take on tasks that they should not be taking on. They're poorly trained for serving in a number of different roles, and they should not be the default agency for all of our social ills. They should be focused on preventing or solving crimes. And unfortunately, they are asked to respond to situations which have little or nothing to do with crimes, such as conducting outreach to the homeless, responding to mental health crises, to enforcing petty infractions, and patrolling our schools. We need to have professionals, again, respond to the homeless, respond to individuals who are struggling with mental illness. We need to have more social workers and guidance counselors in our schools. And we really need to look at petty infractions, which result in the overcriminalization of communities of color. We need to create formal mechanisms to provide for public input, public oversight, and public accountability. And it's important, again, that areas that I just mentioned, where the police department are not properly trained, whenever there is an interaction, unfortunately, it has resulted usually in some sort of a terrible catastrophe. And it's because the police department is not trained to respond to a lot of the social ills that we struggle with in our society. To build public trust, we must have public accountability. Our preliminary report proposes 5 major recommendations: create public participation and oversight of departmental policies and leadership. It's important, again, that the public have some input and oversight into police policies. Redesign public safety and the role of police in society. Minor offenses should be decriminalized with the goal of reducing negative contact with the public, particularly in communities of color. Third, ensure real and independent oversight, accountability, and transparency of individual officer misconduct. As the former city council member and public advocate, we need to have a warning system, a red alert system for officers who continue to engage in a pattern and practice of misconduct without any discipline. Fourth, we need real independent oversight and transparency of systematic misconduct. We need to establish a codified use of force standard with real legal consequences for violations. I want to thank the state legislature for banning the chokehold, but there's other uses of force that need to be codified, and there needs to be one standard as opposed to multiple standards all across the state of New York. Police reform is beginning to happen in New York and across this nation, and that's the cry that you hear on the streets. And so we've got to listen to these protesters, and we've got to move from protesting or taking the protest and basically responding to them in like fashion with some real reforms. Police are entrusted with awesome power by the public, and the public should have a clear and direct say over how that power is used and what constitutes an unacceptable abuse of that power. And I want to leave you with one simple message. There may not be a vaccine for COVID-19 or systematic inequality, but there is one against racism and anti-Semitism and crime. It's called a commitment to our highest values: unified public action, and the rule of law, which should apply to everyone in our society. When Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was asked upon his return from the 1965 Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March with Dr. King, "Did you find time to pray?" He famously answered, "I prayed with my feet." It's also important that everyone understand that the Montgomery boycott didn't last for days or weeks. It lasted for 300 some odd days until there was reform and change. So in this moment of challenge and change, we are called to come together as one and to remove the artificial barriers that separate us, and to pray with our feet and to defeat the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and systematic inequality, and to address the fault lines which unfortunately have revealed themselves. And I'm proud to stand with you in that fight. I'm proud to be with you. And I'm proud, obviously, to have the opportunity to speak before you this afternoon. And at this point in time, I'd be happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney General James. That was a very informative and eloquent statement of everything your office is doing and of the aspirations that we should all work toward together, arm in arm. And during this time of the COVID virus, as you pointed out, there are a couple of other, if not more, viruses that we have been contending with lately. Of course, systemic racism and the age-old anti-Semitism as well. We seem to be seeing a more overt expression of anti-Semitism these days, and especially in social media. At the same time, we are trying to fight for Black lives. How can the Westchester Jewish Council, how can congregations, how can individuals support your office in terms of civil rights, inequality, and the unfortunate confluence of people who have racist attitudes and expression towards Blacks, towards Asians, and towards Jews, because we haven't seen this level of anti-Semitic discourse rise so freely to the top of the public's awareness. So how can we help your office?
So we are witnessing, as you mentioned, an alarming rise in attacks and in acts and displays, public displays of anti-Semitism across this country, and particularly online, where individuals are defending comments from public speakers. And as an African-American, those comments should be denounced publicly. This is also an opportunity to teach individuals. This is really a teaching moment for me and for others. We need to teach individuals about the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh. We need to talk about the experience, the Jewish experience. We need to talk about the civil rights movement and how we work side to side. And it was Jewish blood that was sacrificed as well as Black blood. But the bottom line is that blood was sacrificed. We need to teach our children the history of racism and anti-Semitism. We need to go back to the beginning of time and talk about slave codes and Jim Crow and how our law, unfortunately, is embedded with racism as well as anti-Semitism. We need to talk about how we are segregated in terms of where we live, and that's not by accident. In some cases, it was intentional. And we also need to recognize how the law is both the shield to the Jewish community and to the Black community. And we must stand arm in arm and stand together against acts of hate against other marginalized groups. And so I have always been a student of history. And whenever I experience pain, it's important that others recognize the pain that I am suffering from, but it's also that I share in that pain with others and that we stand together. And so I look forward to working with this organization as we host events that introduce other communities and groups into your communities, and that we spend time together. I'm so honored to be a member of a religious organization, a church, where we come together and talk about these issues with synagogues here in Brooklyn. And it's an honor and a privilege also, most recently, where on a Zoom call, was Met Council and others, just listened to the cries and to the comments of individuals of color who have experienced racism in their lives. We've got to break down these walls. They are not intractable. They can be solved. They can be addressed through the spirit and through the power of love.
I want to thank you, because I think there's nothing as powerful as congregations praying together, visiting each other, breaking down the barriers of the other, not being educated about the other, that leads to an unnecessary discomfort with others. And also I might, my personal wish would be to have school funding. It's not your office perhaps, but school funding not based on property tax.
Right.
Because
No,
that's a barrier.
That is a barrier. And I was lucky, I was so proud. I'm trying to remember the name of the synagogue in Manhattan, but I was honored and privileged where they allowed me to come. What?
I was with you. I was with you. Yes, it was Central Synagogue.
That's right. And they gave me the opportunity to give a sermon. And it was probably the one of the honors of my life. And believe it or not, they invited me back.
Why wouldn't I believe that? I have another question. And by the way, for those of you who have submitted questions online, excuse me, Attorney General James is more than happy, excuse me, to get back to you with an answer and follow up to your questions if we haven't gotten to you. But I know that we're a little pressed for time, and I would like to know how the Office of the Attorney General Charities Bureau can support struggling nonprofits and congregations at this time, when this is a source of comfort and education, and yet financially undergoing a heavy burden.
Yeah, so our Charities Bureau has responsibility over charitable organizations all throughout the state of New York. And it's our responsibility to ensure that the charity is not being abused, is not being taken advantage, that individuals are following the law and being responsible in protecting the contributions and the actual corporate structure of a not-for-profit. We have seen and we have taken action against a number of not-for-profits, which unfortunately has used not-for-profits as personal piggy banks. And it's totally inconsistent with the law. It's important that everyone on the board, everyone who is a CEO, everyone who is a financial officer and or executive understands and recognizes their role and understands and recognizes the law. There have been many changes to the law. Our Charity Bureau, from time to time, we give seminars, we give Zoom conferences with respect to educating individuals on their responsibility and educating them about the status of the law in the state of New York. I know that Gary Brown, who is the Attorney General in charge of our Westchester office, would be more than happy to set one up for this wonderful organization. But I want to, again, try to assist individuals, and I do not want to confront not-for-profits in a setting where unfortunately they are violating the law, when oftentimes it's too little too late, and oftentimes we have to impose penalties and fines and seek restitution when individuals are violating the corpus and basically abusing either intentionally and or in some cases unintentionally, or maybe negligently ignoring the law in the state of New York is rather unfortunate.
Thank you very much. And I would like to make sure that we let you get back to work. So Lisa Roberts, may I turn this back to you?
Yes, thank you so much, Harriet. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And our sincere thanks to Attorney General James for your time today and for everything you do every day to make New York State a safer place for us all. Our thanks also to everyone who made this event possible. And this concludes today's briefing.
Thank you.
Thank you.